Welcome to the Speak the Spark interview series with Leah Lamb. Today's guest is Michael Meade.
Michael is a renowned storyteller. He's also a prolific author. He's a scholar of mythology, of anthropology, of psychology. And he's really known for bringing his storytelling, not just, he really brings it into the world. He really brings it, is very committed to helping us understand how these old mythic stories apply in very practical ways to our everyday lives. He's worked in prisons, he's worked with street kids, and he has really extraordinary interpretations of helping us understand these ancient myths and understanding the deep knowledge that's there for us to access in the times that we're living in. I am particularly fond of this man because he is so committed to really carrying forward this other story, the story of the genius myth is what he calls it, and understanding that this genius is alive in all of us and helping us come to this awareness. And as we do that, also just really hearing that he is really, I feel like, awakening the genius in so many as he brings the story up more and more alive in our culture. And I'll say that just because I got to see him speak at Pioneers many, many years ago. And I had friends be like, you should do this storytelling thing. And I was like, storytelling is for kids and libraries. Why would I do that? I tell naughty stories for adults. And then I got to see Michael. And I got to see Michael with his drum. And I saw him carry this old story into my modern life and help me understand my world. And he also then helped me understand how to understand the context of politics and life and my love life, all through this old ancient story. So it is with great honor that I get to introduce you to Michael Meade, and he's going to carry us through this evening with a story. So we're going to hear a little bit of story, and then we're going to talk, and then a little bit of story, and then a little talk. You can always throw in your questions into the chat room, and then we will also get to open up for Q&A where we can hear you speak your questions near the end. So without further ado, Michael Meade.
Good to be with you, Leah.
Good to be with you.
Trying to get oriented to this virtual space.
I know, it's different.
Now, it does seem a little like looking into your own psyche, where there are all kinds of parts, some of which are autonomous. But yeah, Good to be here.
Yay. So could you start us off with the chapter of Poder?
Okay, so usually I play a drum, and there's a whole incantational aspect to it, but Poder is the story, it's a Guatemalan story. It's a Mayan story. You find it in southern Mexico and Guatemala. And it begins with a woman who's pregnant and about to have her first child. And she goes into labor. She lives in a little village with other people who just live in a simple village. And when she goes into labor, they call the midwife. And so now the midwife is there. And then pretty soon the labor's coming on heavy, and we're reaching the crowning moment, as they call it. And the mother is completely committed to giving birth, and she's concentrating on what she's doing with her body. And the other people that are there are focused on what she's doing. And so when the baby comes out, the only one that sees that this little child has been born with gifts is the midwife. The midwife sees the child and sees the gifts of the child. And in this case, the child has a clay bowl with water in it in one hand and a green cloak on his little back. It's a little boy. And so the midwife takes the bowl and the water and the cloak and puts them away. So now no one has seen the gifts of the child, the gifts the child is born with, except for the midwife, not the mother, not the other people that are helping. And so then the birth, everything that happens after birth happens. And since it's an old story in that tradition, the mother stays with the infant, just the two of them, quietly in a pretty much of a dark hut, as they get to know each other on the outside the way they had known each other on the inside. And while that's going on, The midwife leaves and goes out into the mountains, which they call the Holy Mountains. And when she gets out there, she goes to a certain place where there's a cave, and she gives the gifts of that child to the people who reside out there. And then she returns. After 7 days, it's time for the whole village to come in order to welcome this child, because that's the way people used to do it. And that's the day of naming. And so on that naming day, 7 days after birth, they give this child the name Poder. Poder, which means luck, which means power, which means fortune, which means fate, which means mystery. They give that name to the child. And Poder begins to grow like any child. He has good days, he has bad days, he has nightmares, he has great dreams, and he grows in that way until he reaches adolescence, or he's on the verge of youth. And at that point, he begins to have two questions in his mind, like burning questions that he's thinking about all the time. And the two questions are, do I have anything to give to the world? And does the world have anything to give to me? And he goes around asking those questions, and no one has an answer. And one day he thinks of that midwife that he knew helped his birth, but also that everyone in the village considers to be wise. And so he goes to the midwife and says, I have these burning questions. Do you have any answers? Do I have something to give to the world? And does the world have something to give to me? And the midwife says to him, well, now it's time to leave the village and to go out searching in the world. And so Poder goes to his mother and his father to say that he's leaving. And his mother, of course, both of them give him blessings, and his mother gives him food to take and water. And Poder leaves the village and sets out into the holy hills. And maybe we'll stop there while he's wandering out into the holy hills.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for bringing us into Poder,
Yeah.
into the world of myth.
Yeah.
I just have to start at the beginning, because here we are at the beginning of this course, and here we are at the beginning of this story. And here you spoke also of, usually you start with an incantation.
Yep.
So I'd love to understand just your way of what you've learned about how to carry stories. And even like, let's go back to, we know that a myth is a tale who doesn't have a known or named author. But as someone who, like in terms of description, but as someone who carries myths, can you tell us the mysteries of what a myth is and how it lives with us?
Well, the word myth comes from the Greek mythos, which means story or to relate it. But on the other hand, mythology is the companion and opposite of logic. So that the ancient Greeks, for instance, had the idea that you needed two kinds of intelligence to even perceive the world. And one kind was logic, which was reasonable and things that you could follow the patterns in the mind, the logical patterns. But the other was mythologic, a different kind of logic. And that's the logic of the soul, but also of the heart. And so it's more about the feeling, and it's more about imagination, and it's more about relatedness. Stories are about relating, and relationship is really about stories. The two people in a relationship, if we think of a typical one, come back at the end of the day and share their story with each other. That's how they remain related. And so on one level, myth is story. On another level, it is the door to the mysteries of imagination. So an old definition of myth is a series of lies that tell the truth. Myths tell the truth that the facts can never quite add up to. Myths reveal mysteriously the deeper elements of life. And so in a modern culture, like in America or throughout the world where you have mass culture, one of the problems we have is the lack of shared mythology, so that people don't feel they're in the same story together. And so then when something goes wrong, they can kind of not only reject each other, but they can want the other person to get out of the story altogether. And so we're living through a time where the greater stories are broken, and we have to find our way much more on our own, which I think requires that we awaken the soul inside ourselves with its own story. That myth is more found inside now than it is found outside.
Mm-hmm. And what are you, I know that you are so committed to understanding and explaining what's happening in our time. You've talked about that we have this, the death of dreams, you know, and the death of imagination. I don't know that you use the word death, so pardon me, but you're talking about how our dream world and our imagination world aren't activated in so many people's lives, and the consequence on our culture. And I'm just fascinated because you speak about ritual, you speak about rites of passage, you speak about initiation, and you do this through the archetype of a storyteller.
Yeah.
And can you weave for us how these four things are so intertwined in a way that so many of us don't get to experience anymore?
So we're saying myth and imagination, initiation.
Myth, ritual, initiation, thresholds, rites of passage.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
I've been studying you, and I'm just like, God, there are these threads that you're weaving that bind culture together, and you're doing it as a storyteller.
Yeah. Well, that's what the storytellers have always done. They're the weavers. And so in the first part of the story of Poder, we see it right there. First of all, the birth is the first initiation. Death is the last one. We're on the initiatory path whether we know it or not. Most people don't know it. But initiate means to step in, to begin. It also means to change one's life completely. And so the newborn has gone from the inner sea of the mother's womb, from that enclosed, shared space, very intimate space with mother's imagination and mother's blood, and has been pushed pushed really into the world, which is the initiation of the adventure of life of that unique soul. And so, and then each soul that comes in is gifted like Poder. That's the whole meaning of the story. It's also, by the way, supposed to be the meaning of the Christ story. The idea isn't just that Christ is born and brings a religion, it's that every child is born gifted and deserves the attention of everyone, because each child bringing gifts to life. Each child is a gift of life to the community if the community were only to know it. Now, at the same time that the child is being born, the mother is being initiated further in her life. If it's a woman's first birth, she goes from being a woman to being a mother. There's a literal change in the name, which indicates an archetypal change. So even though that's forgotten in this culture, she's being initiated as well. And the culture, typical traditional cultures, would have some greater imagination of how they assist the mother in her initiatory experience. And then, so anyway, their initiation is there at the very beginning of the life story. So they're connected that way. And then I think of one way I think about a person is a dream deposited in a soul around which a body is wrapped. And the job of the person is to reveal the dream that they brought to life. And at that point, dream and story are almost interchangeable. It's the dream of life, but once we begin to live it, it becomes the lived story. And in terms of what's happening in the world right now, it becomes the lived truth of a person. And so then what naturally is going to happen, you see it in the story again, when Poder becomes adolescent, he's outgrowing childhood, right? Childhood is a matter of growth. It's a developmental process based on growth. You reach the end of childhood, and growth is different. It's not that you can grow from the end of childhood to an adult. Some transition has to happen. And in this case, Poder goes wandering out in the world, having burning questions, looking for his gifts, really. And that's the second big initiation. And it's also the second birth. Notice he goes back to the midwife who was there at his birth. And she now is the one who tells them it's time to have the second birth and leave the village. And that's one reason it's a tremendous story. It actually shows the first two initiations in life, and the midwife is part of both of them.
You know, and listening to you, I'm receiving, it's like you're bringing forward this old ancient wisdom of how, I don't know, to be human isn't quite the right word, but how we can live as humans through these old rites, through these old initiations, which we've lost relationship with. And then you bringing these old stories to us, I feel like it's almost like this mirror. It's like this piece of like, oh, can I see myself in that reflection? Can I see myself in that piece? And I'm remembering something that you said once that just landed in me so deeply, which is that behind this dimension is the mythic dimension. And I wonder if you could speak more about that, like our relationship to our everyday world and what's happening in the mythic plane.
So in one way it's behind us, in one way it's within us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Irish simply called it the other world. And so it's the inner other underworld, you could say. So this other world, that's part of our experience. And it is an intense and important part of our experience. So right now, I mean, literally this week and in the past weekend, we're living through the story of truth and falsity on a national scale. And significant to me is the entire process that's happening right now that has the country more or less mesmerized. One woman told a part of the story of her life, a traumatic part of her life story, and it was enough to stop the Judiciary Committee. It was enough to stop the country's imagination and shift it to something very deeply personal. And it was enough to call in the FBI in order to get more clarity about stories and about truth. And so one of the things I'm interested in is how each story, each person is carrying a story trying to unfold. And so we imagine it's unfolding from within, but in a certain sense, it is unfolding from behind. And so it's connected to ancestral imagination and all kinds of things that people have forgotten in terms of culture, but the soul never forgets. And the idea is that when we're in trouble, we go to the story being carried by the soul because it has capacity for imagination and it has resources that people don't have otherwise. I was so struck watching Dr. Blasey Ford tell her story. And whatever was happening around her became diminished compared to the fact that she could reach into her soul and tell a soul story. Maybe not all the facts are there, but the essence is there. And that is still enough to stop most of the wheels of the outside world. To me, I call it living myth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Should we go to the second chapter?
Well, I'm trying to imagine, there's a few things we have to pull out of the first part.
Okay.
So the first thing is Poder, who represents everybody. In this case, it's a boy, but the meaning of the word Poder is luck and fate and charm and giftedness, and so it applies to everybody. I call it the genius that is born with the person. Genius doesn't mean high IQ or spectacular gift. The word genius means the spirit that's already there, so that every soul coming in brings a genius in, the spirit that's already in that life, so that inside the soul there's a spirit, and it's unique in each person. It used to be called the genius. So the evidence of the genius partly is the gifts of a person. So Poder has these two strange gifts, but they're taken away. And the symbolism of that is the family never sees the gifts of the child. Occasionally that does happen, but mostly it doesn't happen. And that's often why when a person gets old enough to go to college or something, the ideas of the family don't necessarily match the dream of the soul. You know, that thing where the family says, well, you should do this, you should do that. The family has very little idea of why that soul came into the world. And so then what happens is we need other people that are maybe connected to the family, but somehow outside, who can actually have the conversation with us about how do we look for what we're really longing for. So that becomes the midwife, who is the midwife of the biological birth. And then there's another midwife, sometimes called a mentor, at the birth, the second birth. So a person to be human has to be born twice. The second birth is the birth of the psychological birth, but it's also the mythological birth, because now that person's going to leave the family, leave the village, and step into the story of their own life. And in this case, he's headed out to the Holy Hills, which is a suggestion that it's a sacred journey and that everybody's on it by virtue of being born and being human. It's a little bit forgotten culturally now, but everyone is on a sacred journey to find out what their gifts are and then to figure out how to give their gifts to the community. And so that's, I think, where we stopped, yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. So now Poder leaves and he's wandering out into the Holy Hills, and he has food that his mother had prepared and some water, and he's wandering for a long time. And sometimes when I'm telling the story, I'll say, and he encounters other people out in the hills, other young people, and some of them are really lost. I mean, they've lost their orientation altogether. They have no idea where to go, and others are a little bit deluded by this or that. He keeps wandering. Eventually, he runs out of food. Eventually, he runs out of water, but he keeps going. And eventually, he encounters some people out there in the hills, and he says, listen, I have two questions that are carrying me forward in life, and I'm wondering if you have the answers to these. And he says, one is, do I have something to give to the world? The other is, does the world have something to give to me? And they said, yes, you've come to the right place. So come in and visit with us, but you really should eat some food. So they feed him, and then they go to the cave and they bring out the clay bowl with the water in it, and they bring out the green cloak, and they say, these are your gifts that we have been holding for you, and now that you have arrived here, we're giving you the gifts. And now we're going to connect you to so-and-so who has similar gifts, and that person will show you how to use your gifts and use them in service of the community. And so Poder now gets his gifts back and begins to get instruction how to live with and how to properly use the gifts that were part of his birthright. So that's would be part 2, I think.
And in your book, you speak about your own journey of finding your gifts and your gifts of coming into relationship with these mythic entities.
Well, the first thing that happened to me, and it was like Poder, I was 13 and a half. 13 was a big year for me. And 13 and a half, I was growing up in New York City, kind of on the streets a bit. And we had little gangs, and my little gang got in trouble with a much older gang. And then one day I was in a movie theater and I went to go to the bathroom, and the members of the older gang suddenly appeared around me. And when we got to the bathroom, they threw me down on the floor in the bathroom and then pulled out their knives, and they were going to carve me up, because that's how it went at that point in the streets of New York. And I'm laying on the floor of this rather smelly bathroom thinking, wow, I didn't think this life was going to be this short. And somewhere in the midst of feeling threatened, I would say my ego departed. Just thought, I don't want to be around for this pain. And then all of a sudden the voice came from inside me, no preparation, but it came out rhythmically, full paragraphs. I started telling them a story. And they started listening to the story. And when people are going to do harm, they get a certain look in their eyes, and that look went away. And the knives went down. And at the end of it, they just said, they asked me a few questions, and then the leader of the gang said, okay, you can go. Just tell your friends, never mess with us again. So I literally go out of this theater, 13 and a half years old, going, I just found something stronger than weapons. I just found something inside myself I didn't even know was in there that knows more about what I should be doing than I know. And I went right back to everybody to tell them, here's what happened. And they didn't even hear what I was saying. They just said, let's go get them. How dare they? And so on. And I must say, at that point, I had no one in my life that I could share that with and have them understand it. And so I was carrying a certain kind of knowledge that I couldn't really, it took me probably 20 years to figure out how to live with that. But the essence of it was right there at 13 and a half. I was a storyteller from the inside out. And part of the message was storytelling saved my life. And then I realized later on, oh no, it also gave me my life. And so then I wind up being, by profession or whatever you want to call it, a storyteller. But it was in there all along. And that's what started me later on thinking about how we come into the world with gifts and we just need to get them back in our own hands. And then just to put a cap on it, what used to be done in rites of passage for girls and for boys was to help introduce them to themselves. One other meaning of initiation is to reveal oneself to oneself. And so the function of initiation, you could say there's two levels. One was to introduce a person to the cultural norms and what was expected of them. That's like a superficial level. The deeper level was to awaken the gifts inside that person and bless them and confirm the gifts that they have, as happens in the story of Poder. I had an experience of the gifts, but no one around to confirm it. It took a long time for me to get confirmed. So that's another thing. Everybody's gifted, everyone has genius, but it has to be confirmed by someone outside ourselves. There are gifts, but they're not completely our gifts. There are gifts to give, but we don't own them. And until a person finds their gifts, in a way they're not completely themselves. And even if a person finds their gifts, until it's confirmed at a meaningful level, they don't have those gifts yet either.
That piece of conferment, it's I feel like I live in a culture where people are desperate to be witnessed. Yeah. And this desperation to be witnessed can actually be very exhausting to have to witness. Because it's like me versus the giving of the gift.
Yeah.
There's a difference between I need to be seen and like I'm going to give you this gift. And so that conferment, can you tell us a little, if it makes sense, because I know that you do this with others too, in terms of what did you learn and how was it confirmed in yourself, and what do you as a storyteller and as a mentor, an elder, do to confirm that in other people? What's the distinction between conferment and witness?
Well, confirming, the Catholics use the word confirmation, but the old word was blessing, that you actually got blessed for. So for years I've worked with young people, but I like to work with people when they're in trouble. I like, because it's in trouble when we're ready to change. And I have found that people change more rapidly and more thoroughly when they're in trouble. And then I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for people in trouble. So I've worked with a lot of young people in trouble. And it was in the course of that I started to understand how important confirmation and blessing can be for a person. So a lot of my experiences in mentoring and confirming and all that just came practically from the need. You have a young person who's suicidal, and they're suicidal because they don't know they have value inside themselves. A lot of people in the culture think they're empty inside, come up against a difficult situation or a tragic or traumatic situation, and they kind of think, well, I'm empty, what do I count? I don't count for much. This is an enormous universe. I'm just a speck in it. Maybe I don't even belong here. And I learned to just say to young people, you don't have to make something out of yourself. You already are something. You are born. And I started to talk to young people in order to help them directly say, you came into this world with a genius, and no one has recognized that. But when you've recognized the genius, you'll have aim in your life, you'll have purpose, and you'll have something to give. And then the next step is it has to be precise. Like someone walks into a group of young people and say, you're all great. Well, that's not quite effective. I saw someone do that once, and one girl raised their hand and said, yeah, which part of great am I? Because that's what they want to know. And I've heard people say, those young people that are just showing off, what they're doing is crying for attention. There's something in the soul that says, I want to be seen as me, and I want to be heard. And nowadays, when everybody's left literally to their own devices, and they're all distracted out with their electronic devices, They're actually not getting seen and heard. They may have a bunch of friends on Facebook, but they're not getting seen and heard. It's damaging to the soul. And so I was in a position where it hadn't really happened to me, and yet I wanted to provide it for younger people. And I realized that doesn't work. If I haven't experienced it, how can I give it? So I had to go back into my own story and examine some places where someone had actually blessed me in a surprising way. So for instance, I'm running in gangs when I'm a kid, and one of the older guys pulls me aside one time and just said, this isn't really your thing. You shouldn't be in this. And I'm trying real hard to be a tough guy and everything. And he said, you're not built for this. He said, you're aimed at something else, I think. And so I would say, just step back, because I don't think you should get hurt. I think you're going somewhere else. That's an amazing thing to have happen on the street from someone who's not educated. But he somehow had that instinct for being a mentor. And I heard that. I took that in. Another time I was getting ready to get kicked out of school because I was a problem in school. I would have the highest grades and the worst behavior. They couldn't figure out exactly where to put me, so they were going to kick me out. And one of the teachers pulled me out in the hallway and started yelling at me and said, you're a good student. You're a good student. Don't get kicked out of school. So I had those kind of initiations. And so when I wanted to work with young people, I had to tap back into, I call those positive experiences where someone is blessing my own soul. And so then from there, I took both the courage and the permission to try to confirm and bless young people. So when I work with young people, I take chances. If I think I see a genius quality, I will pull them aside and say, I think your genius might be language. I think you have a natural gift for language, and try to help them feel it. And then do what I can to say, yeah, there it is. It's right there. Just because it gives a stability to the psyche and it gives an orientation to the soul. And people expect that. That's why young people are taking so many risks. They want to be fully born, they want to be seen, and they want to be heard. And if it doesn't happen in youth, people are still trying to get it later on. And the good news is you can get it at any point in life. Part of that waking up, the second birth, is hearing the calling. So there's an old idea that everybody's being called to a meaningful life, and the calling is calling to the genius that's already in there. It's not an accidental calling, it's very specific. And so I always tell people the calling keeps calling. Even if we're not listening, it keeps calling. We're here to be called into becoming ourselves, and once we do that, we have gifts to give. And then the world is so damaged now, so broken, so full of neediness that all the gifts are needed. And so anyway, I get most of those ideas from stories and then try to match my own life to the stories.
I remember hearing a little bit of your story about your resistance to the war. Mm-hmm. And you're going into prison. And then what awoke inside of you there? And I was also listening to a little bit, another one of our mythologists among us, Martin Shaw, and his story of going out for 4 years into the wilderness and how his eloquence came alive in relationship to that. And then I just speak of my own experience of spending what I call sometimes a little bit too much time living on the edge of a cliff. Mm. And I remember someone saying, wow, it's like that person that goes off by themselves are so lonely, and being like, gosh, I've never been lonely out there.
Yeah.
I've been alone, but not lonely. I've been lonely in cities. But I've always had the company of the muse or the company of the stories or and so just I would love this. And it wasn't until I was listening to your interview that I started to see that theme of these storytellers that also know how to hold silence or live in silence. I'm curious about your own experience with that and how the stories come to you. So
it's an interesting thing. On one hand, you can't stop talking. Like, I have that Irish genetics, and I'll start and then, it's one story after another. They're just lining up to get back into the world, and I'm just, the vehicle. On the other hand, I found my real connection to myth in solitary confinement. And I tell the story in the new book because I'm trying to say something about, there it is, awakening the soul, because I'm thinking the subtitle is A Deep Response to a Troubled World. And so I think we are in an initiation where there's a collective initiation that's trying to happen. It's trying to happen in this hearing in the Judiciary Committee. That's a collective initiation. If men would become more knowledgeable about how much abuse is being heaped onto women, if men would become knowledgeable about how abusing someone else, abusing one's own soul, that would be a cultural initiation. And so things are trying to happen on that level, also on the environmental level, a cultural initiation into a greater understanding of the connection between culture and nature and the symbiotic aspect of all of life. That's trying to happen, but it can only happen individually. In other words, the individual has to awaken their soul, then enough people awaken to their souls, and then this collective initiation, I think, can occur. The initiation is very unique because the soul is unique. It's very hard to find the steps of the initiation because the steps are different for each person. You're on the edge. I have to be put in a cell with no one there for months and months on end. I mean, I can't tell a story to anybody. I can't even find anyone to talk to. But then what happens is I'm all alone, and then I'm not alone. There's visitors, and they're not human per se. What happened is characters from myths are visiting me in the cell because I've been reading myths all along. I thought it was a hobby. Now they're in the cell and they're giving me advice. And so then I had a kind of a short period where I had to decide, am I losing my mind or am I finding my mind? And the old definition of mind is the poetic essence of a soul. And so I realized I was connected to myth. When there was nothing else there, I was not alone, like you were saying. I was connected to myth and mythic imagination. And I kind of found myself in the very depths of descent, dark, empty, alone in a cell. And I found that I wasn't alone, and I found what I was actually connected to. And for some people like Martin, it's nature. It's different for each person in some ways, but everybody has a deep soul and everybody has gifts that are down there and resources that are not tapped usually until we're in trouble. And now we're all in trouble. So I think we're being called on to tap the deep resources, first of all, to give meaning, purpose, and direction to our own lives. And then secondly, to get a collective reimagination of what it is to be in human culture in connection with nature.
Thank you. I think we're going to, let's see here. I'm going to invite people to start raising your hands if you have questions. I'm going to ask one more question and then maybe we can go to the next chapter of the story of Poder. But first I want to talk a little bit about the eternal nature of storytelling and the ethics of changing a story. And I figure as someone who carries the old myths, you might have an opinion about this. And I think my big question is, as someone who has studied so many of the old stories and who's someone who's very tapped into listening the stories that are asking to come through this time, it's like I see you engaged on both planes, right? As a scholar and also as a deep listener. And I'm curious about, you know, when I've looked at old stories, what I have come to see them as you were using the human body as a metaphor before, you know, and that the bones of these stories oftentimes they carry forward, and the skin on them, you know, as they age will change and shift and morph according to the times. And I've learned in my own deep inquiry of like, how do we carry these old stories forward, how important it is to go and listen to their, like, to respect their heritage, to understand where they come from, and to listen to the core structures, and to respect the core structures that show up in stories and all around the world from all different cultures. And one of the pieces that I've heard that really feels resonant to our times, that's shown up in so many stories, is this piece of whenever we refuse someone from the table of communion, a great curse is cast. You know, it feels like that shows up in so many of these stories, you know, and it's like, I could apply that to our president right now. Our president has been refused from the table. We've gotten so excited by creating this archetype of the monster that we've created this archetype of the other that we've refused. There's no place for him at the table of communion. So I'm like, well, then there's our old stories have some wisdom, even if it's not quite aligned with exactly how this looks. So I'm curious, as someone who's got such a breadth of mythic stories, if there are other pieces of wisdom through other stories that you see carry forward that just really apply to our times, like spot on.
Well, many, many things. And so the way I work with stories is I'll tell a story or part of a story, and then I ask everyone, where are you in the story? If we had to come and find you, where would you be? I always say the detail that strikes you in the story is trying to give you something. And it will also give you the key into the story. If I can find the detail, like let's say the detail is Poder running out of food and water and having now wandering, all he has left is his questions. If that's the detail, then that's the key into the story for me. And that detail will be connected to some experience or memory in my own life, and it will also be connected to some emotion. And so as soon as I can get into that in a more full way, now I'm in the story. Now it's a living territory. And the story teaches. It teaches itself. I remember being at one of these big conferences, you know, with a lot of well-known psychologists and philosophers and stuff like that. And I told a story, and then I started describing the meaning of the story. And someone said, well, okay, that's really good. What book is that from? I said, no, it's from the story. And someone else said, no, but he means, which book can we find that in? And I said, it's directly from the story. I'm learning directly from the story. There is no book on this. And so the story is its own book, and it teaches each person uniquely. Each person is unique. Each person gets unique knowledge from a story. So one of the difficult things is to figure out what story are we in. It's actually tricky because we're in it. And so it's like trying to solve issues in a relationship. We're in it. How do we figure out how to solve it, you know? And so so I take a shot at it once in a while. And one that I think is really meaningful right now is this old idea of the collapse of the world. So mythologically, the world can't end. I'm always trying to send this message out to people. Don't worry about the end of the world. As a matter of fact, the word end doesn't mean finito, good night, over and out. End means loose end or loose thread. And so there's always a loose end from which the world starts again. So then you can start to figure out we're in one of these winding downs of a big cycle. We're at the end of a big cycle, which also appears as collapse and hollowing out of institutions. But the old word apocalypse, the modern word is apocalypse, fiery end of the world. The old word is apocalypsis, which means collapse, renewal. Collapse and renewal at the same time, because the world is starting over even as it's coming apart. And so mythologically, it's extremely important, I think, to realize we're in that moment where everything is going awry. It's chaos here and there. But then if we have the eyes to see, it's another world that's starting over, and we get to have a say in that world because we're alive, we're ensouled, and we have something to give. And so I can't explain how I got into it, but I started to just treat every story as if it was teaching me where I am and where I'm trying to go. And so you said something about bones, and I'll have to say, I don't know what people think about how you tell stories. I don't rehearse. I don't practice. I mean, I know the stories because I'll either read it or I'll hear it, and I'll consider it, I'll hold on to it. And then each time I tell it, it comes out a little bit different because I'm different, because the circumstances are different, because the audience is different, because there's something happening in the air. And I give myself the freedom to, as you're saying, keep the bones in place and then let the skin, the flesh and the skin be different each time. So it's a certain tradition of storytelling that's inventive, improvisational, and based in the fact that the story is trying to come to life again in this moment, and therefore it appears differently when it appears this time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Should we hear the next chapter?
Okay, so where did we leave our boy?
Can't tell me a story.
Poder had his gifts, and now someone had to show him how to use the gifts. And so this is connected to the old idea that older people used to watch the children coming along and saying, oh, look at her. Doesn't she remind you of Auntie so-and-so? And Auntie had this kind of gifts. Let's send her over to be with Auntie. So he got to go with whoever it was that knew what that bowl was and the cape was. And it turns out that the bowl with the water in it and the green cape are the gifts for someone who's going to be a rainmaker. And so this is a story from southern Mexico, Guatemala, very dry areas. Rain is really needed in order to nourish the crops. Crops are needed so that people can eat. And so he's going to be someone who serves the people by helping to create nourishing circumstances. In the literal version of that is going to be the crops. And he then learns how to make rain by, in the story it says, rolling up into the clouds and then pouring some of the water from his gifted bowl, and that causes the rain to come from the clouds down to the earth, because otherwise the clouds might pass by and not direct rain on the fields of his people. So eventually he learns how to roll up into the clouds, make rain, come back down, and he goes back down to his village. He doesn't tell everybody what his gifts are or what his ability is. He keeps it to himself. But every time clouds come, he goes to a cave. There's another cave where he has hidden his gifts, and he goes into the cave, gets the clay bowl, gets the cloak, rolls up into the clouds, and causes the rain to come down. And all the people are in wonder because they're getting more regular rain and they're growing the crops well, and no one knows what he's doing, but somehow they all recognize that there's someone special in the village and that Poder is valuable to them, and he becomes beloved by all the people. Now it happens, there's another young guy in the village who has no idea what his gifts are, and maybe there was no midwife when he was born. We don't know what happened, traumatic birth of some kind. He has no gifts. He feels empty and rejected. And when he sees Poder being honored by everybody, he's resentful and envious. And so he begins to follow Poder until one day he sees him come out of the cave and roll up into the clouds. And he stays hidden. Poder goes back and puts his gifts away and walks off. And this young guy who had no gifts of his own goes and takes Poder's gifts, the bowl with the water and the cloak, and having watched Poder, he rolls up into the clouds, but not knowing what to do, he dumps all the water in the bowl, and so rain starts to pour down from the clouds, an endless amount, a torrent of rain. Floods are occurring everywhere. Floods are wiping out the crops. They're wiping out the village. Everybody's praying to be saved. And in the story, it says they prayed so hard that God finally turned his attention, or our attention, to them and said, oh, you've misused your gift somehow. That's what's happened here. Because of the misuse of the gift, that's why you've almost destroyed the world. And so I'm going to stop the rain and stop the floods, but I'm going to cause people to not know what their gifts are anymore. And so at the end of the story, it simply says that ever since then, people are born and each person is gifted, but people in the world now, since that time, don't know what their gifts are. So it's a story about being gifted and knowing about your gifts, and being gifted and not knowing. And I like to tell it because it reveals so much about the nature of the human soul, but it reveals a lot about the condition we're living in, where people can not know their gifts and wind up in a dominant position, Donald Trump. You know what I'm saying? That I remember growing up, people used to say, you can be anything you want to be. Well, the truth is, we're lucky if we turn out who we're supposed to be. And then also growing up, I heard anybody can be president. Well, how's that working out? You know what I'm saying? That if people can get aligned to where their soul is going, it usually benefits the world. When people don't get aligned, like the boy in the story that steals the gifts, then there's damage happening in the world. Gifts, when they're given, enhance life. When they're not given, they can actually be destructive. The word talent comes from the German, and it means the weight used to measure gold. And so a talent is a weight used to measure gold. If we can't figure out what the talent is and learn how to give it, it becomes a weight on our soul. I know people who are depressed because they can't give their talent or haven't figured it out. So to have a gift is to have also some kind of responsibility and even a potential weight. The more we give the gift, the more lighthearted we become, the more generous, and the more connected to the flow of life.
Thank you for joining us. For more information, visit leahlamb.com.